World Insight coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, the Rio Olympics have ended. Questions are flying over China's gold medal slump as the nation finishes third. But China and its people remain upbeat. Has China moved beyond its obsession of winning gold? And the video of a 5-year-old Syrian boy pulled from the rubble went viral worldwide last week, sparking outrage among netizens. But will international attention finally translate to more relief in Syria? And we begin with the end, the conclusion of the first ever Olympic Games in South America. The Brazil city of Rio de Janeiro bidding farewell to their time as host after 17 days of exhilarating competition. International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach officially closed the game with a samba-fueled extravaganza Monday morning Beijing time and handed over the Olympic flag to the city of Tokyo, the host of the 2020 Olympic Summer Games. After 17 days in Rio, the U.S. finished on top of the medal list with 46 golds. Great Britain nipped China for second place by winning 27 golds, and China claimed 26 gold medals, down from 38 in London 4 years ago and 51 at the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. How exciting over there. For more on the Olympic Games, we are joined now live with our correspondent Joe Richards at the Olympic Park in Rio de Janeiro. Joe, welcome to our program. Finally comes to an end. I'm sure there are a lot of great memories for you. Which moment, which athlete, which category?
Good afternoon from Rio, a much quieter Olympic Park than behind me, as you can see, after these 17 days of sport. So many performances really have been a joy to watch on many different levels. So Michael Phelps, for example, in the pool was simply spectacular to see how he became the most decorated Olympian of all time. Usain Bolt as well, winning his triple of men's sprinting gold medals, another spectacular achievement. Elsewhere, there were new stars that we saw here at the Rio Olympics, with Simone Biles, the gymnast, taking 4 golds. She was a joy to watch. Wayne van Niekerk, the South African, smashed the men's 400-meter record. So there were many standout performances, but there were many other stories as well here at the Rio Olympics, with countries such as Fiji winning their first ever gold medal, in the case of Fiji in the men's rugby sevens. And also, of course, we also saw the refugee team taking part, which really put into perspective perhaps many of these sporting achievements, and it was fantastic to see some of those athletes with their life stories taking part in these Olympics.
Certainly a lot of marvelous moments and also firsts during this year's Rio Olympic Games. Having said that though, Joe, tell us what about the response that people have in Rio de Janeiro about the host city and also about the host country, Brazil. There was a lot of talk whether Brazil could do a good job, and according to Mr. Bach, the IOC chairman, that is marvelous job, quote unquote.
The debate is going to be set for the coming months and probably years and if not decades, for how Rio has benefited from these Olympics. Certainly it's easy to stick with the carnival of the closing ceremony and the video highlights of the great sporting moments, but of course there's so much going on behind those scenes. There have been many problems here. Many problems didn't materialize quite as much as was expected, but if we just go through a few of those issues, obviously doping cast a real shadow over these Olympic Games, more a problem obviously for the IOC rather than necessarily for Rio. In the ticketing there were real problems, many empty seats at many of the venues, and of course also the scandal including the IOC, with Pat Hickey of the Irish Olympic Committee being arrested for alleged ticket touting. So many headaches there. Elsewhere, there was the green diving pool, not catastrophic, but certainly didn't look good and pointed to organisational problems. Perhaps, though, the bigger question really is who benefits from this and who is this for, with viewers watching from around the world, but many people in Rio were unable to go to the Games, and the legacy of these Olympic Games remains to be seen. As you said, it's likely to be debated for the months and years even to come. Finally, Joe, your thoughts about the Team China's performance, this time 26 gold medals, and on the medal tally, the 3rd place after US and the UK. Do you think it's a good performance? Also,
what have been the athletes, coaches, and members of the Chinese delegation, how do they view this year's performance?
This is also going to be a long debate, no doubt, for China, because, as you said, it's a major change from the performance in London. Many fewer gold medals and disappointments in certain areas. In the gymnastics team, failing to take a single title. In badminton as well, there were goals lost there. Of course, there were other sports in which China performed as fully expected. In diving, taking all but one of the gold medals, and in particular, really strong performances and historic performances from Wu Mingxia and Chen Ruolin, who the two women both taking 5 gold medals now in their entire career, setting absolute records there. So a bit of a mixed batch really for Team China. As you said, a surprise there that they were unable to win quite as many, and perhaps this is now the debate that China will have to have. How will it be preparing for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games? But of course there is another side to this, which is that few expected Team GB to perform quite as well as it has. The British team had its best performance in history at an Olympic Games, obviously away from London, so not few expected quite for that to happen as well. So a mixed bag certainly for the Team China.
Yes, our own Joe Richards in Rio de Janeiro on the very last second after the games wrapped up. Thank you so much for your work, and many of your colleagues as well. Thank you. Well, the delegation China sent to the 2016 Summer Olympic Games is the nation's biggest overseas contingent ever, with more than 400 athletes making the trek at Rio and finishing with 26 gold medals, 70 in total. The women's volleyball team's victory has made one of the deepest impressions for many Chinese. The leader of China's delegation has given his evaluation of the country's performance at the Games. Mr. Liu Peng highlighted the success of the women's volleyball team and praised the contributions of all athletes who participated in this year's Rio.
A thunderous cheer. The Chinese public was beaming with pride and joy after the country's women's volleyball team won gold at the Rio Olympic Games, a victory reminiscent of the country's past, when national pride was closely linked to achievements in international sports. China's women's volleyball team, under Lang Bing's coaching, won gold for the first time since 2004, beating Serbia in the final. Not to be outdone, China's table tennis players swept all 4 gold medals for the 3rd Olympics in a row, while its divers topped the podium 7 times out of 8 events. Breaking away from the country's traditional strengths, triple jumper Dong Bin's bronze and the men's 100-metre relays coming in at 4th place are the PRC's best ever results in those disciplines. There were also sports in which China has long held the upper hand, but suffered setbacks at Rio, such as the 3 out of 5 titles in badminton from the London Games, which China failed to defend. But the Chinese people's view of the Games is also taking a new shape, with a decreasing focus on gold medals.
Well, I think people should not treat getting the gold medal as the first thing they focus on when they watch the Olympics. I'm inspired by the athletes themselves, their individual efforts that they put in to challenge themselves.
Perhaps that's why the outspoken swimmer Fu Yuanhui became a social media hit in China after a 1-minute interview on the 2nd day at Rio. For her, winning gold clearly wasn't everything. Now, with a rising emphasis on the individual, both Chinese athletes and the public may just be growing greater in their Olympic spirit, hand in hand.
We hope that will be the case. For more on the Rio Olympic Games, we are joined here in Beijing studio, Mr. Dong Jun, official commentator at the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, and he's also co-founder of the Ever Beijing. Welcome, sir. Also joining us from London, we have Simon Pusey, sports broadcaster and commentator. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we're having Mr. Eric Farnsworth, Vice President of American Society and Council of the Americas. Gentlemen, welcome to the 3 of you. I know all of you are sports fans. And I would like to tell our audience if they have noticed our selection of these 3 gentlemen coming from 3 countries, the U.S., the UK and China, certainly the top 3 countries on the medal tally. So let me begin by asking you, Mr. Farnsworth, the very first on top of the tally, how does the United States evaluate its performance this time? Briefly.
Well, I think most Americans are quite proud of the effort that the United States team gave in Rio. There are always high expectations when the United States goes to Olympic Games, whether summer or winter. And the record tally, I think, this year justified some of those high expectations. But some of the individuals like Michael Phelps, Katie Ledecky, Simone Biles, the entire U.S. gymnastics women's team, as well as some sprinters like Allison Felix. I mean, these are names that are now national celebrities in the United States. And I think they have very bright futures after their sports, even as political or sports commentators or what have you. So I think their futures are very bright.
Yes, indeed. If people listen or watch American TV or radio during the Olympic times, the headline, the very top news would be how many gold medals and how many athletes have already won their big time at the Rio Olympic Games. Let's go to Team GB. Of course, the UK did so well, Mr. Pusey. I'm sure this is quite a celebration. The best over the past, how many? 108 years, by the way. Are you happy?
Yeah, I think massively, especially after London. You always expect the host nation to do really well or to do better at an Olympics as a result of the fact that they're hosting it. But it's a real surprise that Team GB pushed on so much since London. I don't think that's ever happened before, and especially in sports that traditionally the GB don't do very well in. Very surprising to get a gold in the hockey, for example, the women's hockey, in the golf as well. We got one in gymnastics. We've never had a gold in gymnastics. So yes, we had some of our athletes who are traditionally very, very strong. Mo Farah, for example, winning, but we also had some really unexpected gold medals, and I think that's what's made people here really proud, is the fact that we got golds in 15 different categories across the board. So I think that's really good, and there's definitely a real feeling of a good mood feeling here in the country.
I see the lights in your eyes as well when you're talking about Team GD's performance during this year's Olympic Games. But let's go to China. What about China, Mr. Dong? Finishing third place in medal tally.
I should have come second. You know, I predicted before the games opened. I thought China would comfortably sit in the second place after the United States, well ahead of Team GB.
Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, we thought that Team GB stood a very good chance, you know, with a significantly reduced Team Russia. This time around, they will come third very easily, but we didn't expect Team GB to overtake China.
Okay, let me just repeat what Mr. Liu Peng, who is the boss of the whole sports arena, I guess, here in China. He's talking about two things. Okay, we are not obsessed by gold medals anymore. Here's what he said. But he also said the Olympic Games, though, is about faster, higher
and stronger.
And stronger, the three adjectives, which means, it seems to me, he's still trying to suggest we should really do well in these elite Olympic sports. What do you think to say? How does the general Chinese public feel about this?
I think China is still relatively new to the Olympic Games compared with many Western powers. Only started participating in the games in 1984, and in just over 3 decades, China has already become the 5th biggest gold medal winning country in the world. That's a remarkable achievement. I think 26 gold medals were good, pretty good, but it doesn't serve as an excuse for badminton, gymnastics, not to do some kind of soul searching and to find out what actually went wrong in their preparation for the games. I think by repeating the 3 strong elements in the Olympic Games, China is still trying to educate the public, because the majority of the nation still are not necessarily so familiar with every sport included in the Olympic Games. So that's what the government does every time.
You see, though, some very interesting phenomena, promising phenomena, I would say. For example, about golf. Shan certainly have won the 3rd place. That's amazing. It's never done before in China.
If you remember, I warned you that she may have a shot.
Well, you did. You did do that.
Because she was ranked as high as number 4 in the world. She won a major title before going to Rio.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, but she still tries so hard.
But her story, Dongjun, really brings us a interesting perspective. That is, how much money a country needs to devote to these kind of elite Olympic sports. how much it should be like run by the market and the athletes themselves, how much it should be the so-called whole nation system, which China is still using when it comes to elite sports, such as for the preparation for the Olympic Games. So briefly from you, before I invite the opinions from the other two. Dongjun?
So I think demographically, for the size of the population of China, and also the transition of development model for this country, I think definitely more money should go into sports. But it's a structural question or issue. How much should come from the government budget, and how much can be raised from the society, and how much capital actually business can invest in sports. I still do believe that Chinese should have interest in a much broader perspective, spectrum in sports. Chinese should practice in many more new sports, while you don't give up your efforts in those traditional sports.
All right,
we have great potential.
Let me ask Mr. Puzey, because Mr. Puzey, you worked in China as a sports commentator and sports broadcaster, and now Team GB did so well, and yet the same question remains with Team GB as well. According to the numbers coming from the UK, every gold medal this time won by Team GB at the Rio Olympic Games cost about more than £4 million. £4 million. That's a big number as well, particularly when you are experiencing the austerity, even Brexit, by the way. So what is the relation, really? The money and where the money comes from, and eventually the sports performance at the Olympic Games. Mr. Puzey.
Well, I think money definitely plays a big role, but I don't think it's necessarily the amount you spend, but it's the strategy behind it. You look at the USA and China, they will undoubtedly, those countries spend more than we do. But what we've done well, Team GB has done well in the past, is to strategically pick the sports that Team GB think they'll do well at, so cycling and rowing, and they've spent a lot more money on those sports. And they've done that over a period of years, and you now see that coming to fruition. So a couple of years ago, Team GB did very badly in swimming, and they cut the swimming budget massively. And it's brutal, but it works. You see cycling and rowing in the latest Olympics. We did so well in those sports. So I think that's a model that other countries would do well to fit, is to really target those sports where they think they can get gold medals. If it is about gold medals, then that's the way to do it. Money definitely does play a part, does play a role. I think the cycling team, Team GB's cycling team, had more money spent on it than every other country combined in their cycling team. So that gives you an idea of just what money can do.
Yeah, Mr. Farnsworth, also from the U.S. side, you see Team GB, their devotion and investment by the government and the civil society 20 years ago, back in the John Major's administration. Eventually, 20 years later, it seemed blossomed. It's a long period of time. And that period of time in countries like the United States and the UK usually would be scrutinized because it's too much, and too much time as well. So what do you make of the US system at this moment? Is it going to be sustainable? How do you see China's model?
Well, I think it's exactly right, and the comment about strategic investments is spot on. There are a lot of countries that are good at some sports, but it's very difficult, frankly, to be good at all of the sports that are contested in the Olympics, and it takes a major economy to be competitive in even most of them, if not all of them. If you look at the top 10 medal winners from Rio de Janeiro, you have the G7 countries, and the other 3 countries are China, Russia, and Australia.
That's right.
And so you can clearly see that wealth matters in the context of being competitive broadly in the Olympic movement. Having said that, there are smaller countries, for example, Serbia is very competitive in basketball and volleyball, etc. So you can make strategic investments. The United States model is a little bit different. Yes, we have primarily private sector-led investment, but you also have to look at what's happening at the youth development side of things. And at that point, it's generally led by families, in other words, parents who are investing, in some cases, thousands of dollars in training and coaching and camps and travel and competitions for their children. And it's not until the children get to an elite level, a truly elite level, that you begin to have support from outside sponsors, to say nothing of government support. That comes much later. So at the U.S. level, at the U.S. system, a lot of it's driven by families and parents who really have a dream for their own children, and that goes to the point of, do families have the resources to be able to devote to their own children? I think that's a question that probably is relevant for everybody, but certainly in the United States.
Right. It is not just individual athletes, individual categories, but also the whole Olympic movement. Huge amount of money being put into every Olympic Games. Are they worthwhile? This is certainly a debate likely to go on, where we still enjoy Olympic Games every 4 years, definitely. Having said that, though, about China, the whole China celebrated its players winning first place in the women's volleyball final. For those of you who do not know China's history of sports, certainly women's volleyball played a big part. When Chinese women's volleyball team took on Serbia for the Olympic title, 73%, think about that, 73% of Chinese families were watching the live broadcast on TV. Meanwhile, articles about Chinese volleyball dream team in Sina Weibo received more than 210 million views just within a couple of hours time, and certainly that fever is still continue. Dongjun, first of all, you should maybe 2 or 3 sentences help our audience worldwide to understand what exactly is that sentiment about women's volleyball that Chinese are enjoying so much.
Well, I think this significant win by the volleyball team, women's volleyball team, means differently to an older generation and a younger one. The younger people may be wondering, you know, what does it mean? So why does it mean so much to you, father and mother? Right. But yeah, you know, the women's volleyball contributed glory to the country even before they participated in the Olympic Games for the first time.
Right.
And that was
before 1984 in Los Angeles.
Yes, China first won the World Cup in 1981. That was a time when China didn't know much about the Olympic Games.
Not even the rest of the world.
Yes, and they learned from a Japanese coach first, and then they developed a very strong team, starring a player now, the head coach of this team, Lang Ping or Jenny Long. And you know, that reminds people and the reminiscence of an old glory when China won 5 consecutive world titles, including the Olympic gold medal.
Yeah. But the question is, Mr. Pusey, knowing what you have already acquired from China, many knowledge about this, what would a win of the women's volleyball team this time mean for the Chinese when you observe it from afar?
Yeah, well, I think you get some sports, don't you, in every country that you're kind of guaranteed that you're probably going to do pretty well in. And for China, it's obviously ping pong and it's gymnastics and diving, and volleyball is one of those things that you were third in the world, and China had a great chance of getting a medal. But it's just one of those sports, and just the circumstances of it as well that makes a great story. So China lost their first game, and then they were behind to Brazil in the second game, and these comebacks and these stories. This is really the narrative that gets people going, and once you get that momentum, we had a similar thing here with Team GB in the hockey. You get that momentum of there's a story here, you know, we could really do it, and everyone gets involved. And like you said, those are incredible viewing figures, 70% of Chinese families watching. So I think it's just, you can't predict that before a games. You can't predict Fu, the Chinese swimmer, winning everyone's hearts. That's why people love the Olympics. It's those stories really, as opposed to just winning golds. It's those stories that you really can't predict before the games. Those personal
stories really shine over the spectrum. For China is volleyball, and for the United States, of course, Mr. Phelps' win for the 3rd Olympic Games, so many gold medals, is also a heroic story. Having said that, though, it is not just the American athletes that are being covered by the U.S. press, but also the Chinese athlete stories. For example, the young Chinese athlete Fu Yuanhui, who is a very funny girl. You know, she made those hilarious comments after she won the 4th place in the swimming category, and she became an overnight hero almost in China, particularly went viral. Mr. Farnsworth, what do you make of those phenomena? Is it because our audience is getting ever younger, or is it because really we need to have a relaxed moment in the very competitive atmosphere of the Olympic Games?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, people have a broader sense of perspective now. Look, it takes in some ways just as much commitment, just as much training, just as much desire to be a gold medalist in archery as it does to be a gold medalist in soccer or volleyball or swimming. And those athletes tend not to get the same amount of exposure or appreciation, but it takes the same amount of effort. And I think that it frankly takes the same amount of effort to be a fourth-place finisher as it does to be a third-place finisher, but you don't get a medal for it. So I think that there is an appreciation that will continue forward, that as people are really devoting their lives to pursuing their own individual dreams, that if they don't achieve necessarily a gold medal, that doesn't make them a failure. It makes them a huge success. They just didn't win the gold medal. And I think that there's a lot better, healthier appreciation in terms of what that actually means to the individual and to the teams that they're competing on. So I actually think, broadly speaking, that's a very good thing.
That's true. And before we wrap up, of course, we are already transferring from Rio to Tokyo for the 2020 Olympic Games. A lot of things, big budget and also anti-corruption thing, and also with the anti-doping issue still hanging in there, a lot of uncertainties. But before we go, Mr. Dong, final word from you. What do you make of China's performance this time, and how do you likely perceive where Team China is going with the thought-provoking game that we are having this time?
I think 26 gold medals and 70 in total wasn't too bad a performance, although finished at number 3 on the table. I think when they come back this time around, people will start debating about how to build a new structure, what role the government should play, and what society and especially the population can practice sports to build a bigger and more solid foundation of the pyramid. I think it will be fascinating to see what goes on.
We'll see what happens next. Looking forward to the Tokyo game already. Thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen for being with us and sharing this wonderful moment with us. And congratulations to all your home country's teams' wonderful performances, including Team China. Thank you so much, Dong Jun, Simon Pusey, and also Eric Farnsworth. Really appreciate, gentlemen. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. The video of a Syrian boy covered in dust and blood in an ambulance evokes anger and attention, the pride of the children of war-torn Syria. Can images bring about real change? That's the question we're going to ask. You're watching World Insight, and now we turn to the footage of a wounded Syrian boy from Aleppo. The video has gone viral on the internet and caused outrage around the world. The war in Syria has lasted for 5 years already. What happened to the poor boy is daily life for Syrians. Why is the world paying attention to this only after the release of the footage? And for people suffering in the war, heated debates online about it is far from making real impact.
Not a word, nor a cry. Omran Dakhnish, the 5-year-old Syrian boy, sat in the ambulance wiping dried blood and thick soot from his face.
I took him to the ambulance and I tried to speak to him, but he didn't say a word. He said nothing. Eventually he managed to ask me, "Where is my mom and dad?"
The video of Omran has drawn the attention and outrage of millions worldwide. But for Syrians, it looks as if the world has just discovered how Syrian children are suffering every day in a war that has raged for more than 5 years. Omran is not alone. Aleppo, where Omran was discovered, is an important battlefield in the war. After the release of Omran's image, Russia, as a supporter of President al-Assad, agreed to a 48-hour ceasefire in Aleppo.
At least 100,000 children living in the eastern parts of the city are facing danger of outbreaks of waterborne disease.
Many still remember the picture of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian toddler whose body was washed up on a Turkish beach. Fighting between government and rebel forces have left Syrian children with no good choice. Images of suffering children often draws attention and sympathy. However, for Syrians involved in the civil war, shedding angry tears is not enough.
And for more, the Syrian boy video here in Beijing, we have Ms. He Wenping, who is a professor of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences with us. In Washington, D.C., we're having Michael O'Hanlon, who is a director of research for foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Also in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Christopher Chambers, professor of journalism at Georgetown University. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, I want to go to you, Professor Chambers. Coming from a media's perspective, how do you think this specific picture, this specific footages become such a focus of the world's attention? Can people really make a change with images like this?
Well, this image has already resulted in a ceasefire. I mean, whether it's genuine or sincere or not is another story, but it has generated at least a temporary stop to some of the bombings. But it does bring an interesting question. What is the context of the conflict? Sometimes images do create immediate policy implications. If you look at the napalm picture from 1965 of a young girl in Vietnam, that galvanized a lot of American domestic opposition to the Vietnam War. If you go back to China 80 years when the Japanese attacked China, you have an iconic picture of a baby in a flaming city, alone and burned, and that picture galvanized a lot of support in the United States to boycott or embargo oil to the Japanese, which sped up Japanese plans to bomb Pearl Harbor. So sometimes images do have an immediate effect. But sometimes in a complex situation like this with Assad and ISIS and people not really knowing which side is which in some regard in the United States among the general public, the impact of the image might be fleeting. We might be heartbroken and enraged, and then something else will come along. We have a very short attention span.
Mr. O'Hanlon, from a geopolitical perspective, how do you see this photo? Will that be a wake-up call? Can capitals now work together? When I asked this question, I already felt my naivety when asking it, but really, can there be a wake-up call?
Well, I think the professor, unfortunately, is correct that it's likely our attention span won't really be sustained on this tragedy. As you know, in recent years, there have been a lot of images, some of them from Syria, like the 3-year-old boy who washed up drowned a couple of years ago or so, maybe last year, I guess, but also images of shooting victims from Paris to San Bernardino to Orlando, bombing victims in Turkey and the broader Middle East. And we just have so much of this coming at us all the time and we realize that in an era of electronic media, it happens, and it's just sort of a sampling of reality. There are other tragedies like the North Korean starvation catastrophe of the 1990s, in which 2 million people died and basically nobody saw a thing because the country was so shut off. So I think at this stage in history, people are aware that they have to, I guess the more cynical thing would be to say we have short attention spans, and that's true. But at the same time, we're also aware we can't base policy on an emotional reaction to a certain image. And I think President Obama has projected an American fatigue with the wars of the Middle East that's fairly representative of a lot of Americans, and they're thinking about what we can realistically do to stop any of these tragedies. So it's easier for Americans to just sort of shut it off. And we're not seeing much debate about this in the presidential campaign. So we have someone who will replace Mr. Obama in just a few months, but there really isn't discussion that I've heard in the presidential race about what to do about Syria. Americans just have this sense of frustration that Middle Eastern wars are not really something we're good at solving.
Right. Ms. He here in Beijing, when Mr. O'Hanlon talked about the American fatigue about the Middle East issue, there's also a fatigue in the rest of the world about our incapability of doing something, of the U.S. Indifference, as some see it, towards some of the crises in the world, and even blaming the United States for starting some of the crises. Let's just put them aside. But when the rest of the world watching this specific images of that little boy, how are we shocked? And as a result of this, are we really gonna do anything? Or it's just gonna be there for a few days and we move on to the next image, next footage?
Well, this kind of a picture, even though it's quite sad and also it's touching, I think unfortunately, yeah, it's just stay there for hours. Maybe less than that. You know, when people talking about the Olympic, that's a very joyous picture, and then a lot of miserable picture, not only from Syria and from other natural disasters or earthquake, whatever. So many, and the terror attack. So so many, and the same day, even same hours, appears on the people's, in front of people's eyes. So I think there's simply people couldn't do anything about that, especially those mass people. They have no power. They are not the decision makers. But even for the decision makers sitting in the White House, I don't think those pictures, even though it's so emotional, can do any leverage on those decision makers. Because simply it's because it cannot compare it with what happening like in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. That Vietnam War, because this is United States just one big power involved with that war.
So and players are very clear.
Yeah, very clear and very limited player. But this time around in Syria, there are many, many players involved in that conflicts. So you cannot imagine President Obama, if he were facing some protest on the street and give his pressure, saying you must do something, get involved in the Syria war immediately to rescue the boys like that Aleppo boy or the beach boy. So there's not that kind of thing happening.
I think two issues
nowadays.
there, Mr. O'Hanlon. One is the disconnect between the crisis realities and the policies available to handle these realities. The other thing is the constant appearance of crisis and the inability of players within crisis to be identified. Those two are not likely to change, and that's why we see, Mr. O'Hanlon, the rise of populism, of emotional politics worldwide, not to mention your presidential election in the United States. But the thing is, with this very temporary ceasefire for 2 days, can players further work on this consensus? Can a consensus now become more sustainable than it used to be, at least on the issue of Syria? Mr. O'Hanlon.
I don't think that's going to happen soon, I'm afraid, because the United States, I think, still has a contradictory policy, and Russia still has a cynical policy. What I mean by that is that we are still hoping we can somehow defeat ISIS and push President Assad from power while keeping Syria whole and cohesive, all simultaneously, with very limited American commitment of any kind of resources. That's our contradiction. Russia's cynicism is that they are willing to prop up an old friend, even at the expense of continued bombardment of civilian neighborhoods and making war against a wide range of groups, many of which are relatively moderate, but Russia and President Assad just claim they're all extreme and terroristic as an excuse for their military approach. So Russia is cynical, we are contradictory and not very committed, and therefore I don't think we're headed in a good direction. In my opinion, the United States and its allies will have to increase the resources we devote to this conflict, but simultaneously accept a lower goal for a political resolution, some kind of a confederation model in which I think President Assad could remain in charge of one part of the country. I think that's the more realistic way to deconflict the approach of Russia and the United States, but we're nowhere close to that sort of change at the moment.
Thank you very much for your analysis. Very interesting ideas. You just help us to understand it is not just cynical or cynicism about politics. It's also cynicism about how journalism has been working over the past decades. Mr. Chambers, if we look at the photograph of the 5-year-old Amran, it had brought white helmets, the rescue organization, into focus. Take a look at this. Syria's white helmets nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Al Jazeera described the organization as heroes. Russia Today says the Syrian boys' image shamelessly exploited for West's war agenda. And according to a report on global research released last year, the white helmets have been good at, quote, manipulating the media. Of course, there has been always continuous debate about the nature of media and where they come from, what agenda they have. But Professor Chambers, people are getting ever more cynical about media's agenda in our world today, hadn't we?
Well, very cynical, and with good reason. Media likes to, especially Western media, especially American media, which is based on a capitalist sort of model. Titillating stuff sells. Brutality and horror doesn't necessarily sell. Now, on the other hand, you have images of this boy, which he's not dead, unlike the toddler on the beach on the island in Greece. That was, for some media outlets in America, too horrific to show. People might say cynically, it wasn't titillating enough. A live toddler who is in distress is more titillating than a dead toddler. Some people are that cynical. Now, on the other hand, you do have governments that have a national interest or movements in this conflict, where somebody might say that, say, the white helmets are a propaganda device. That has not been proven. I don't know whether they have to prove that they aren't. However, that's part of the cynicism too, because we can't really find an objective point to measure that from, because you have governments and other forces have one message, and you have other people have another message. So it's tough, and that does mean that maybe perhaps journalism isn't doing its job, because it should be looking for that objective point, that objective comparison point.
Right. Ms. He, very briefly from you, from a political analyst perspective, how do you see the nature of the media, particular nature of the media on this very controversial issue? Briefly.
Yeah, media can play both positive and negative role for ending or even expanding a war or conflict. So fully depend on who they represent, the interest group. So I think that's a very tricky thing. Media, if they play very good role, they can even end a war. For example, like this Somali war, when those media cover those, the Black Hawk Down, and then immediately Clinton government pulled this army out. I think that's a good sample.
Time has changed, but whether important players will be able to use their power for the common good, that is still a big question mark. Thank you for the three of you. At least you are contributing to the common good discussion. Michael O'Hannon, Christopher Chambers, and also He Wenping. Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.